Welcome, everybody. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. 42 years ago today, on November 4th, 1979, Iranian militants stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, initiating a hostage crisis that lasted more than a year, and signaling to the world the emergence of a new, assertive, and belligerent Iran that would not play by the rules of polite international society. A little more than 2 weeks after that, on the 20th of November, also 1979, Saudi fundamentalist militants stormed the Grand Mosque of Mecca. And though their seizure of that holiest of Islamic sites lasted only 14 days, it too signaled the birth of something new, a newly religious Saudi Arabia, in which rulers, frightened by the specter of Islamic militancy, decided to make concessions to it rather than to fight it, and to allow their country to become a principal exporter of a puritanical form of Islam with whose stultifying effects the region is still grappling. Or so says our guest today, Kim Ghattas, who is the author of a remarkable book about the region entitled Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. You cannot read that book, which was named a New York Times notable book of 2020, and not emerge impressed by Ms. Ghattas's deep insight into and moral clarity about the region that both of us study. And we're thrilled to have the opportunity to engage with her today. Ms. Ghattas is currently a contributing writer for The Atlantic magazine and a non-resident senior fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she has had a long and storied career in the region, reporting for the BBC and the Financial Times, among others. And before she wrote The Black Wave, she wrote a best-selling book about Hillary Clinton's time as Secretary of State. She's joining us today from Beirut, where she was born and raised, and in whose social, cultural, and intellectual life she is deeply embedded, most notably, in my view at least, as a member of the Board of Trustees of the American University in Beirut, which I consider one of the most important educational institutions on the planet, second only to the American University in Cairo. Ms. Ghattas, welcome to the Kennedy School.
Thank you so much, Tarek. Thank you for this very generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak to your audience at the Belfer Center at Kennedy Harvard School. I'm delighted to be here, meaning in Beirut, but with you online. I really wish I were there in person, but I guess welcome to my living room in Beirut. Thank you all for joining. I see a few familiar names in the audience. It's great to have you. And
before you get, so sorry, I just want to make sure before you get, I want you to say all the words of praise that you're about to say for the Kennedy School and for Harvard. But I do want to also just make sure that everybody knows how this event is going to run. So don't launch into your talk just yet. But if you wanted to say a few words of welcome to the people you recognize, that's totally fine too.
I see Deb Amos, of course, who's a good friend. I see Ada Porter from AUB. But it's just, fantastic to be here and do this. And I leave you to do the.
Great. Sorry, I should have warned you that I was going to do that, but it's hard for me to give up the mic to anybody. Okay, so I just want to let everybody know how the event is going to proceed. So Ms. Ghattas will speak for about 30 minutes. On the Middle East, quote, from the Iranian Revolution to the Kabul withdrawal. And after that, I'm going to abuse my position a little bit to just ask her a few questions before we'll open it up to you, the audience. And what we're going to plan to do is end at about 2:15 Eastern Standard Time, in part to be mindful of the time difference between here and Beirut. And we're really grateful to you for staying up so late. I will note that today's event is being recorded and will eventually live on the internet forever. And so will you, members of the audience, if you choose to ask a question of the speaker. So you have been warned. And with that, I turn it over to you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you. And thank you for reminding me of that very important detail of the date of the 4th of November, which, when you're too close to the page and when you've talked about the story at the heart of the book so often, sometimes you miss the obvious, and the obvious is, of course, that this is the date when the hostage taking at the American embassy in Tehran started. But where we are today is 42 years later, and I think it's important to look forward always, but also to look backwards and understand how we got to where we are. The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard says that it is perfectly true that life must be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And going forward, as I hint in the title of this talk, we will be dealing with many of the ramifications of the Kabul withdrawal. The Kabul withdrawal elicited a lot of concerns amongst allies and partners of the United States in the region, whether Iraq or Saudi Arabia, concerns about America's commitment to this region, but also to its commitments to its role on the global stage as a superpower. Beyond concerns of allies about staying power of the United States, there is concern in Beirut, for example, about a space for freedom that is closing in different ways, from Beirut to Afghanistan, but also all the way to Hong Kong. The angst provoked by the Kabul withdrawal extends to other places, Tbilisi, Kiev, the sense that something is unraveling and perhaps a new era is starting, and I'll get to that towards the end. So there are periods that are ending, there are dynamics that are ending, there are new ones that are starting. But whatever one thinks about the withdrawal, whether people think it was the right decision by the Biden administration to stick to the deal that President Trump had struck, whether they think it was the wrong decision, that there was no other way, that there were other options, what's clear is that every American action has ramifications. This is the butterfly effect of geopolitics and of American power. Because imagine the power that America still has today when the withdrawal of just 2,500 remaining troops in Afghanistan brought about the collapse of the Afghan government and the return of the Taliban. That return makes us feel a little bit like we were being catapulted back to the past. So if we want to live forwards, we do have to understand the history that brought us here. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of American forever wars. Much has been written about American decision-making, invasion, occupation of Afghanistan, but I'm focused on the regional dynamic. And Tarek already alluded a little bit to some of the events I'm going to be discussing and what I focus on as well in Black Wave. But I think it's essential for policymakers to be informed, to have the context, the historical context, so that they not only understand the problem, but they can also formulate better policy. Now, there are many points in time that we can use as a starting point for different dynamics, but I take mine to be 1979. And I found in my research that 1979 was essential, was important to understand, because it was not just a year that brought geopolitical changes. It was not just a year that was about a military coup or a war starting or ending, or the demise of one political party. It was about much more than that. It was about different dynamics that unleashed change, that affected culture, religion, and society across the region. And I'll detail in a short moment. But I will start with the three key events, which Tarek already alluded to briefly, the three key events of 1979, which make this such a pivotal year. First of all, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, in exile for over a decade, returns to Iran in February of 1979. And what he does is he hijacks a leftist, an ostensibly leftist revolution, which had started in late 1977, was simmering and swelling throughout 1978. And he hijacks it with his acolytes and turns it into an Islamic revolution. And he ruthlessly eliminates those who helped bring him to power, those leftist nationalists who thought he was helping them come to power. It turns out that he had other plans. And it's important to remember that this is still the era of the international left, of liberation movements against colonialism, imperialism, America. Islam as a political tool was still, I don't want to say marginal, but of limited real influence. But by the end of 1979 and after the siege, the hostage taking is underway, by the end of 1979, Iran is a full-on Islamic republic voted on by the Iranians. And you'll ask me, well, perhaps this is what Iranians wanted, except when the vote was put to them in a referendum, do you want an Islamic republic? They weren't quite sure what they were voting on. They thought, well, yes, we want a republic because we don't want a monarchy anymore. And we're Muslims, so I guess, yes, an Islamic republic. They didn't quite still understand what they were signing up for. Later on in 1979, in November of that month, Saudi zealots lay siege to the Holy Mosque of Mecca, and it is coinciding with the hostage crisis in Iran. So at first, some people thought it was an extension of the Iranian Revolution, or that the hostage takers in the Saudi mosque, in the Holy Mosque, were actually Shias or Iranians. But they were Sunni Saudi zealots who thought that the Saudi royals were actually not conservative enough. In this conservative kingdom, which had pockets of cosmopolitan life, like in the Hijaz, on the Red Sea, which is home to Jeddah and Mecca and Medina, you know, gateways to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, where pilgrims came and went. Always, you know, when you have this coming and going of people from around the world, you have a certain sense of cosmopolitanism that is there. And the Hijaz felt that it was still, at the time, a bit different from the interior Najd desert, which was really ruled by the clerical establishment, which had its sites also on the Hijaz area. And so in this deeply conservative kingdom, the interior, come these zealots who've been groomed to some extent by the clerical establishment, and who think that the House of Saud is not conservative enough. The zealots lose the battle, they're killed or put to death later, but the House of Saud recognizes the danger. It has just seen what's happened to the Shah next door and how theocracy rose to power there, and it gives in to the zealotry and to the clerical establishment. And Saudi Arabia becomes even more conservative. And the pockets of freedom that were sprouting here and there, we had just seen the introduction of television, of radio, education for girls, all of that starts being yanked back. And finally, in this vintage year of world events, because there are many more that I'm not going to get to in this talk, finally, of course, there is the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets on Christmas Day, and a war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan ensues, funded and armed by the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. We all know how that goes to some extent. And I'll get into some more details about that in a moment and what it unleashes. But the confluence of these three initially unrelated events unleashes a torrent of dynamics that transform the region, as I was just saying, culturally, socially, and it changes the place that religion has in people's lives and in politics. And it changes things so much and so deeply that we forget almost sometimes ourselves what was before. We almost forget who we were before. And that's why I talk about three misconceptions that many people have about the region, three misconceptions that sometimes even we have, because we've forgotten, you know, over the course of 4 decades, what it was like, even if we look at old pictures of our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation. But it's important to understand what these misconceptions are and how 1979 changed the region, because otherwise I think policymaking is based on faulty assumptions. It's based on the assumption that it was always like this and therefore it will always be thus. Now, initially, and until January 1979, the Saudis had expressed their support for their friend, the Shah of Iran. He was their friend. He was an ally of the US. They were both allies of the US, forgive me. The two countries were twin pillars of US policy against the Soviet Union in the region. So what does that tell us? That initially, until January 1979, the Saudis were concerned about the possible demise of their friend, the Shah next door. It tells us that Saudi Arabia and Iran were not always the enemies that they are today. The Saudis were in fact terrified that the Shah would be replaced by a communist regime. Again, remember, this is the Cold War. This is the time where there is talk about the Soviet domino effect. There is talk about the spread of communism. And as I said, the Saudis and the Iranians, the House of Saud and the Shah of Iran, are twin pillars in US policy against the Soviet Union. And then what happens? So that's the first impression that people have, that Saudi Arabia and Iran were always enemies, when in fact they were not. And then Khomeini lands in Tehran, and he rises to the top, and the Saudis see that the Shah's been replaced by a religious man. And they thought, well, okay, we can do business with this man. He speaks our language. He talks about the Quran, about the Sharia, about conservative values. And even as I knew that this was the subject that I was working on, even though I knew that this was how things had unfolded, even I was still surprised to find one of the headlines of that year in Arabic. And the headline was, Saudi Arabia praises the Iranian revolution. Imagine that. So that brings me to the second point. If the Saudis, conservative Sunnis, initially welcomed Khomeini, a Shia, if the House of Saud, conservative Sunni, and the Shah, a Shia, although he didn't deploy religion in his foreign policy, but he was a Shia, if the House of Saud and the Shah were initially friends, if the Saudis could initially think that it was a good thing that Khomeini had risen to power, what does that tell us? It tells us that the deep sectarian tensions and violence that we see today and in the last few decades are also not the norm. Of course, the historical schism has always been there since the days after the death of Prophet Muhammad. And there have been bursts of violence, communal mostly, but also bigger outbursts of violence and wars across the century, usually about territory and power between the Ottomans and the Safavids, for example. But overall, sectarian violence was not a constant of life. And I would actually argue that over the course of history, and I'd actually love to have a comparative, but I'm just going to put it out there and others may be able to weigh in. I would like to posit that over the course of history, Sunnis and Shias have probably killed each other less than Catholics and Protestants. To this day, I remain amazed by the sectarian tensions in Northern Ireland, which is a subject that fascinates me. So what happened? Several problems and dynamics arose from the events of that fateful year of 1979. First of all, it turns out that Khomeini had grand designs well beyond Iran and well beyond the Shia community. He starts claiming that the mantle of the mantle of leader of the Muslim world. He wants to lead the Muslim world, not the Saudis. He wants to be the leader, in essence, also of the anti-imperial camp, setting himself in opposition to the Saudis, whom he describes as lackeys of the West. He starts stirring trouble at the Hajj. He calls into question the custodianship of the House of Saud over Mecca and Medina. He starts exporting the revolution to places like Lebanon and Pakistan, where there's a sizable Shia minority. The Saudis become worried. They realize that their role as leaders of the Muslim world is being challenged by this man whom they initially thought they could do business with. And so a rivalry is born, and it takes hold in different forms and in different dynamics from Pakistan all the way to Egypt. So how do the Saudis think that they can counter Iran? How do they rally the masses? And they really need to burnish their credentials, because remember, the Saudis have just taken a hit on their prestige. They've just taken a hit with the siege in Mecca. Their role as custodians of the two holy sites is actually in question, and it's a very touchy subject for the Saudis. The first way that they realize that they can burnish their credentials is the war against the Soviets. This allows them to pose as leaders of the Muslim world, fighting against the godless Soviets. And how convenient, they can also get rid of some of their own zealots, these young men whom they've realized are actually a problem. Kindred spirits, yes, they're groomed by the clerical establishment, but they're starting to stir trouble. And so it's convenient to support this war against the Soviets and send off young men to fight there and rally others from across the region as well. Young men from across the Arab and Muslim world discover the power of the gun on the battlefields of Afghanistan. And many of them have already seen the power of the word that Khomeini deployed to rise to power. And all this is unfolding at the same time. The second thing that the Saudis do to push back against the Iranians is deploy the sectarian narrative, reducing all Shias, not just Iranians, but all Shias to tools in the service of Khomeini, this treacherous revolution that is eating away at, nations and religion in the region. And they almost paint them as non-Muslims. And this goes to some of the core beliefs within Saudi Arabia of Hanbali Salafism, sometimes described as Wahhabism, which is ultra-Orthodox, puritanical, and literalist. What happens is, as the Iranians are exporting the revolution and rallying people around this new sort of state-led version of Shiaism, and the Saudis are riling people up against Iran, but also against Shias, exporting a vitriolic version of how you portray the other in the Islamic world. They start both weaponizing religion. The fighting in Afghanistan and in the Mujahideen camps of Pakistan are petri dishes for sectarian hatred. Suddenly, in a town like Peshawar, you hear something you'd never heard before. Echoing from the mosque, you hear the call Shia kafir, Shia infidel. And this vitriol starts seeping into daily life. The power of the gun, the power of the word, they all meld into one. And what does that lead to? That leads to the rise of intolerance, religious intolerance, which seeps into cultural intolerance. You start seeing the closing of cinemas, first in Saudi Arabia itself, a handful of small cinemas in Jeddah. In Pakistan, the rise of Islam there with its own local dynamics because of the dictatorship of Zia al-Haq. You see singers being silenced, actresses putting on the veil in Egypt. Intellectuals start being assassinated for discussing the role of Islam in public life. So what does that tell us? That all of this, the singing, the debate about religion, the vibrant culture, the diversity of political opinions, that all of that was possible before 1979, but not exactly permissible or not exactly as free as it was after, or not exactly as free after 1979. It tells us that the region was not always dominated by these forces of darkness. And I certainly don't want to paint a picture of a region that is a monolith, light before and dark after. Although very often when I was researching my book and I spoke to people in Pakistan or I spoke to people in Saudi Arabia, that's very much the feeling that I got speaking from them. I would get this, these floods of emotions coming out when I would talk to them about the year 1979 and what it had meant for them. And that's why you'll see, if you read my book, that I insist on not just, actually, I don't talk a lot about before 1979. I talk about how 1979 changed the region. And I insist on talking about and talking to the people who tried to resist this black wave that unleashed over the region. And I really try to highlight the incredible diversity that still defines everyday life, but the odds are really stacked against a lot of this this effort to push back against intolerance. And so, to summarize, Iran and Saudi Arabia were not always enemies. Sectarian killings have not always been part of daily life. And intolerance, cultural or religious, did not always define the region. What comes out of 1979 are 4 decades in which these dynamics unfold. And I will briefly summarize them. I'm not going to take you through the details of each of those decades, but in a way, I summarize them by saying that the 80s are marked by the wars in Afghanistan, the war between Iran and Iraq, and hostile actions by Iran against the US. After the hostage crisis, you have hijackings, hostage taking, etc. And during that decade is really when the darkness sort of takes hold, and when some of these cultural changes, still unnoticed, also start taking hold, and the vitriolic language against Sunnis or against Shias starts seeping into the language of people. And so the 1990s, although marked by a détente between the Saudis and the Iranians, is marked by the rise of cultural intolerance. We'll remember the first attacks against tourists in Egypt, the attempted assassination of Naguib Mahfouz, etc. Fast forward to the 2000s, you have, of course, not only the events of the attack of 9/11, when Sunni extremism bursts onto the world stage, a result of the 80s of Afghanistan. And then, of course, you have the US invasion of Iraq, where the vitriol that has been planted, the sectarian hatred that has been simmering and bubbling up, really bursts onto the regional scene with horrific sectarian killings in Iraq that spread to Pakistan and to Jordan as well. Fast forward to 2010, and the decade after 2010, you have the uprisings where, because of course this is not only about Saudi Arabia and Iran and their rivalry, you have local dynamics, which mean that you have dictatorships that are oppressing their people from Egypt to Tunisia, and you have uprisings and revolution. But unfortunately, the Saudi-Iran rivalry seeps back into everything, and you have a counter revolution against the forces pushing for democratization. And you see that most clearly in Egypt and Syria. So where are we today, 42 years later? Where are we, other than in a pandemic that is keeping us physically apart? I think that we are at the end of some of these dynamics that 1979 launched into the region. In each of these decades that I just briefly skimmed over, Saudi Arabia and Iran played a key role. These two countries have agency. I focused my writing very much on the role that Saudi Arabia and Iran have, because I think it's important to recognize their responsibility in bringing the region close or into the abyss. But that doesn't mean that the US doesn't have a role to play, and I don't absolve the US for the mistakes that it has made and the role that it plays in the region. But I wanted to focus on the role that Saudi Arabia and Iran have, and also about focus on how they played the US to their advantage in this dynamic, which I call a ménage à trois. And it continues to this day. If you look at what is unfolding across the region today and what the latest news in Lebanon is, you'll notice that the US is negotiating with Iran indirectly through the E3+3 around the nuclear talks with the JCPOA. And in the region, you have the Saudis and the Iranians involved, first in indirect talks and then in direct talks, which were hosted and facilitated by Iraq. So you have two separate tracks where Iran is talking to the US and Iran is talking to the region. But I think that what the Saudis really want is to talk to the US about Iran and the region. And so that's how I explain the latest diplomatic crisis that we have in Lebanon, where Saudi Arabia's frustration about Hezbollah's growing role in Lebanon bubbled over. And yes, they say that we're done with Lebanon, and they walked out and withdrew their ambassador and expelled the Lebanese ambassador. But it's a roundabout way of forcing a conversation with the US, which runs to the Saudis to say, how can we fix this? Don't let Lebanon falter. And I think that this is about the Saudis wanting a regional conversation with the Americans, whereas the Iranians would prefer to separate those two tracks. And so that's the ménage à trois that the US has to balance as it tries to, I don't like the word deprioritize the region. I think they're right-sizing the amount of energy they devote to the region. But to do that, they will have to engage. The Biden administration will have to engage, and they'll have to find a better way to balance the impact that both Saudi Arabia and Iran have on the region and on American policies. But I also think that what we're seeing is a transformation of the region as religion decreases in importance for young people across the region, as the Abraham Accords take hold in one way or another, and as the young generation in Iraq and Lebanon and in Iran and in Sudan rise against corruption, against dictatorship again, and also notably in Lebanon and Iraq rise against sectarian politics and the role of Iran with Shia militias. So I know that sometimes looking at the Middle East can be, a tad, depressing, or people sort of throw their hands up in the air and say, this is impossible. But I would like to posit really the opposite with some of the final thoughts that I put out there, that this is a region that is changing, that is in the midst of some transformation. I don't know yet exactly how it is going to go forward, but I think that as long as there are dynamics that are unfolding, it means that the die is not cast. And I recently wrote an article comparing Hong Kong to Afghanistan to Lebanon for the Atlantic, detailing the unraveling in all these three very different places, a kind of sudden collapse of these three places, their freedoms, their sense of vibrancy. And yes, I know they are very different, but there was a sense of sudden collapse in these three places. And while I was writing it, I suddenly realized that I was more concerned about Hong Kong and what Hong Kong was losing, because there was a sense of finality there. It's going to be very difficult for Hong Kong to push back against China's influence as the real major, large behemoth and hegemon. Whereas in this region, if I had to find the positive light, the light at the end of the tunnel, I think things are still in flux. And I remain hopeful that this young generation will find a way to push forward in a positive way. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for that, Ms. Ghattas. That was excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to abuse my position a little bit and ask you a couple of questions and then open it up to our audience. And I'm asking our audience members now, as you begin formulating your questions of Ms. Ghattas, to, when the time comes, just raise your hand using Zoom's raise hand feature. I would tell you where to find it, but Zoom always moves it. I assume you'll all be able to figure out where it is. And then I'll call on you. So, I really very much liked this book, and I found so much in it that was familiar and resonant. And the central obsession of the book is one that is my central obsession. As an Arab who grew up between East and West, I always was making the kinds of comparisons I think that are implicit in your book and asking, why is our part of the world not advanced and democratic and characterized by rule of law and justice, etc.? And, you offer a really important answer, and you highlight a kind of a historical moment where things kind of changed. And I like the argument because you are saying none of this is inevitable. We were different and we can be different again. So I actually am, this is a long preamble by way of saying I agree with everything that you're going to say, but I'm going to pretend I don't. Okay. So I guess somebody who wants to be disagreeable could say, come on, come off it. You know, you leftist secular Arabs are always saying stuff like this, like, oh, look at the photos of Cairo back in the 1950s. We used to wear miniskirts. Like, that's completely inaccurate, because the kinds of people who could take photographs in Cairo in the 1950s were a certain segment of society that were going to be, of course, always the most liberal and Western and affluent. But if you were to go into the vast countryside, you would find a population that was highly traditional in all kinds of ways. And you would probably find the same thing around the region. And it's people like you, Kim Ghattas, or you, Tarek Masoud, who are always going around saying things like, oh, when Muslims do things like vote for Islamist parties, or when they do things like vote overwhelmingly for a referendum to make their country an Islamic republic, they really don't mean it. And they really mean something else. How do you know? So what's the evidence that you have for the fact that, no, in fact, religion is an organizing principle in this part of the world? The desire for a politics erected on religious purity is a deep desire that is, if not embedded in the very sinews of Islam, then something close to it. What's your response to that argument?
So I made absolutely sure that I could refute that argument by simply saying, just read about the characters in my book. Just see who is profiled in my book. The voices in my book are the voices of conservative, practicing Muslims. Whether it's Mehtab Rashdi, the Pakistani television anchor who stands up to Zia al-Haq when he orders her to veil and says, no, I know my religion. Who are you to tell me how I should dress? It is people like Nasser Abu Zaid in Egypt, a famous, respected intellectual who grew up in a small village in rural Egypt, who studied with the sheikh, a kutab, who studied religion, whose father wanted him to study religion, and who writes about Islam, and who is a defender of Muslim values, whose wife, Ibtihal Yunus, is practicing conservative but not veiled. It is about choice. It's not about a small minority of leftist, secular, sometimes illiberal leftists who don't believe truly sometimes in choice. So the voices in my book are, I think, the voices of a large majority of people in the region who are not the 5 women in the picture on the Kabul and wearing a miniskirt in the Kabul University. That picture is sort of, the one that everybody holds up. But what was possible then was the choice. And it's that freedom of choice that was also lost. If you want to veil, veil. If you don't want to veil, don't veil. If you want to go to the mosque and pray 5 times a day, absolutely. If you don't want to, no problem. That's what we're talking about here. And I think it's important for people to read about these progressive thinkers in the Muslim world who believe in this freedom of choice, including in Iran, where veiled women are let me rephrase that, because you have to wear the veil in Iran, where women who believe in the veil are also protesting for Iranian women to have the choice to veil or not veil. I don't want this to be only about the exterior appearance of women. It's also about being able to debate the role of religion in politics, in public life, etc. And that's something that people like Nasser Abu Zaid or Farak Foda, who was assassinated for speaking out about the role of religion in public life and speaking out about having a civil state, that's the kind of choices they wanted. And they are not a minority leftist secular, they're not a leftist westernized secular minority. They are very much part of the country and part of their culture. And I think, we need to move away from words like moderate Muslim or, these sort of, there is a large majority that believes in this freedom of choice. And increasingly, the younger generation believes that religion has simply played too big a role in politics and in their life. Do you want to give me the?
No, I completely, I really appreciate that answer. I would say that in the answer, you actually identify what I think is a kind of asymmetry, because, in Egypt or in Lebanon, it is a choice whether you want to veil or not veil, or whether you want to pray.
There is peer pressure. There is, in the 80s.
Well, there's peer pressure for me at Harvard to not wear a fez. I mean, the point is, the question is, how do you connect? So look, here's what somebody would say to you: when we give people in this region a choice, what they do, and I agree with you, we should get off hijab and get onto the bigger issues you talked about. They choose to act in ways that are consistent with the notion that Muslims have a deep innate desire to order their lives Islamically. When they go to the ballot box and vote in democratic elections, they vote for Islamists. And, how can you tie that, which happened in Tunisia, which happened in Egypt, which, happens in a lot of different countries, how do you tie that or lay that at the feet of Saudi Arabia and Iran in the 1970s?
I would say that the outcome of these decades is that has become one of the major options, which was not there before. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, Islamist parties didn't do that well.
That's because Abdel Nasser threw them all in jail. They were,
but in Pakistan, subject to, they were not in jail.
But they were subject almost everywhere to Pakistan. You might be right about Pakistan, but thinking about the Arab world, it's incontrovertibly true that Islamists were brutally excised from political life.
And that was perhaps a mistake. Perhaps the political maturing of societies needs to take its course. And that applies to the role and the participation of Islamic parties, but it also applies to the various coups that took place in the region with much assistance from the West, because the outcome didn't suit, whether in Syria or in Iran, and that's why I think that it's important to point out what I do at the end of the book, which is that yes, Saudi Arabia and Iran, yes, but it is a ménage à trois or à plusieurs right now with the Russians and everyone getting involved. But Iran and Saudi Arabia also have the choice about how they react to the US. And interestingly enough, when the Egyptians voted for Mohammed Morsi, it was the Saudis and the Emiratis who were, not too pleased about that. And, you could argue that had they, the argument goes both ways. Do you want to try it or do you want to risk it? Had you let this take its course, he would have failed. Others will tell you, no, if you let it take its course, then he would have, centralized power, and that would have been it. But I think one interesting country is Sudan, and I'm very curious to see how it's going to unfold there.
Yeah. Yeah, the popular, pushback against this military coup has been really, really inspiring. I want to make sure that people get a chance.
With the involvement, the Saudis, the Emiratis, it's all a hodgepodge.
Right, right. So I want to make sure to get people in, and there are so many threads to pull on. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. You mentioned a very interesting story which I was not aware of until I saw your book, about how the Saudis' initial reaction to the Iranian revolution was one of cautious optimism, which if that's right, which I of course believe it is, then you might have to say the blame for this all going wrong isn't really at the feet of the Saudis. It should be laid at the feet of the Iranians. I'm not, but the last thing I just want to ask you before we open it up to our audience, and again, I'm encouraging everybody to put up your hand, is so what's the way out of all of this? And, we have one model. I mean, when you came in the end of your talk to talk about ways out, I thought you were going to talk about society, because that's ultimately what you and I really care about. But you ended up talking about geopolitics. And my question is, how do we get the societies to become more tolerant, pluralistic, and liberal, as I know that you want them to be? And let me give you something to react to. What about the path forward that is charted by people like Mohammed bin Salman, who say that what we need is a period of modernizing autocracy, for lack of a better word, in which, we're actually going to put democracy definitively on the back burner. In fact, back burner isn't a good analogy. We're going to lock democracy in a box and throw the box into the ocean. But in exchange for that, we are going to liberalize. We're going to allow women to finally take their rightful place as equal members of the society. We're going to reach out and join the world, etc. Is that the path forward?
Well, I'm not going to, is it the path forward? It's certainly the path that MBS wants to see going forward, right? And he looks poised to be king for 50 years. So it sounds like that's what we're getting. I would argue
but the same thing, I didn't mean to say just MBS, like we have the same thing in Egypt, like just this general model. Is it the right path, or does Kim Ghattas have an alternate path that she wishes we would take today?
I don't have, if I could give orders to all the rulers of the region and actually make them implement them, I would very quickly forge my passport, become an American citizen, and run for president of the United States and make it happen. I think that sitting in my living room in Beirut, I think one thing I've learned, Tarek, is that we have to be realistic when we put out policy recommendations. Do I think it's the right way? No, I don't. But this is what we have. So within these parameters, what can be done to move things a little bit this way, move things a little bit that way, counsel, put forward other ideas, because the idealism of revolution is essential, but the pragmatism of figuring out how to change the rules of the game and the politics is something quite different. And that's something that revolutionaries in Egypt have learned the hard way. That's something that is now becoming a lesson that young idealists in Lebanon are learning as they accept that they have to run for office. They have to run for parliament, even if it's the game is rigged. They have to try. And they did it in Iraq. And so you want to talk about societies. I see a lot of pushback against, look at Sudan. Look at how people came onto the street in Sudan to to protest the military coup. I think it's amazing. And I think that the Sudanese don't get enough credit, enough headlines. I think that story is not being told enough. And I really hope that it unfolds as they wishes. But in Iraq, the election results are not perfect, but, there were breakthroughs by independents. Candidates put forward by the PMF and the Shia militias lost a large number of seats. They went from 54 to 17. Yes, we still have Muqtada Sadr. We still have, I forget his name now, all the others. So this is what we are working with. And we just have to keep on pushing and not give up. But do I have a magic wand that suddenly, other rulers in the Middle East wake up and say, hey, you know what, actually, I think democracy is a great thing. I'm going to give it a try. Is there a magic wand whereby, Ali Khamenei wakes up tomorrow and says, this whole Hezbollah thing, Shia militias, I think we're done with that? No. So how do we work on the ground as people, as public speakers, as writers, as activists, as civil society to effect change and to push forward and chip away at systems that don't work for freedom of thought, for freedom of expression? But I'll just say two more things, Tarek, if I may, on Mohammed bin Salman. As you know, I've been very critical of both the Iranians and the Saudis. And, I try to be very balanced and be a fair critic. There are many differences between them also in how they export their power, militias versus checkbook diplomacy, which they can't call back. And, we're left with Shia militias from Lebanon to Iraq that, are on a rampage. And I think that has to be said. But I also think that young Saudis are, I haven't been to Saudi Arabia in a year and a half, but young Saudis, I think, are delighted by a lot of the changes that they're seeing. They are getting more choice, more freedom than they've ever had before. And you can argue that some of it is cosmetic, but it's important. And young Saudis deserve that freedom and that change and that culture. Where I worry is that some of it is too Western and too forceful and too quick, and that you could end up with a kind of white revolution that the Shah had, which backfires. I don't know how he will navigate that. And then fundamentally, I think there's a problem when, to ensure your staying power, you feel, and to effect all these changes, you feel you need to throw a bunch of people in jail. There's something wrong with that model. Unfortunately, it is not a model that is specific to the Middle East anymore. I mean, when I write in my piece about, how Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and Lebanon collapsed, I'm talking about the unraveling of freedoms we took for granted in the 90s and the rise of a kind of authoritarianism that is pushed forward by countries like China and Russia and adopted as a model, including, it seems, perhaps by, leaders in the region.
So, we have only 20 minutes left, and though my every instinct is to keep asking you questions, I have to open it up to our audience, who I think will probably ask better questions than I would. So our first question comes to us from our colleague, Gary Seymour. Let me have him unmute. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much. Hi, how are you? Boy, that was a great presentation. I think you make a very convincing case that 1979 led to the injection of religion into the Middle East in a way that turned out to be very negative. And I love your image of the ménage à trois, but I would just say it's not a very equal triangle, because fundamentally the Saudis want the US to stay in the bedroom and the Iranians want the US to leave the bedroom.
Yes.
So from that standpoint, it's really a matter of the Saudis trying to keep the US engaged and Iran wanting the US to leave.
Yeah.
But so my question is, my impression from talking to well, both Saudis and Iranians, is that their tensions now are much more, I guess, geopolitical and national than religious. I mean, the concerns the Saudis express are not about, Shia theology. It's more about Iran, surrounding them with friendly governments, around the Arab world. So doesn't that indicate that religion is actually becoming a less important factor in, Middle East regional politics, and it's really just old-fashioned, power politics of any region?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for bringing that up. So I'm going to revisit my ménage à trois formula and see how I can caveat it. You're right that the Saudis want America to stay, although they're courting the Chinese, and the Iranians are they want to talk to the Americans at the very least, and it's sort of this frenemy relationship almost. On the issue of religion, I want to make clear that, in my view, in many ways, neither the Saudis nor the Iranians were ever fighting about, Shia theology or Sunni theology. They very much used religion as a weapon, and they weaponized it. And perhaps the rank and file, on the ground were driven by their, religious feelings. But I think that at the top, it is always about power. It is always about influence. It's always about territory and power. But you make a very good point that because the element of religion, the tool that is religion, is kind of running out of steam, both the Saudis and the Iranians are resorting to nationalism to rally the masses. And that's why you see the language that Mohammed bin Salman uses, and even the IRGC and Ali Khamenei appealing to people's sense of nationalism rather than their religious sentiments, as those two countries continue to whip up sentiment. So when the Saudis try to rally the Egyptians or the Pakistanis to the fight in Yemen, it's not about fighting for conservative Sunni values. It's about pushing back against Iran, the country, or protecting Saudi Arabia's borders. So that's part of the transformation that I think we're seeing today. On the Saudi-Iran talks, I'll just say one thing. I found it striking that the Saudis are highlighting how serious they are about these talks, but that they find that the Iranians are not, there's nothing of substance, there's no real progress so far, but we, the Saudis, are very serious. And I think it denotes a new approach, a different sophistication at how they're doing diplomacy in the region. Having had sort of rash beginning from Mohammed bin Salman with the war in Yemen, with the embargo in Qatar, I think they're fine-tuning how they do diplomacy. And I find it very interesting that they want to pose as the more mature, the more reasonable party in this equation, so that they can also turn to the Americans and say, yes, your nuclear talks, they're not going anywhere. We could have told you. But we're talking to the Iranians and we're sitting down and we're very serious, but we're not getting, neither one of us is getting what we need out of these talks.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have comes from William Green. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, how are you? I wanted to say first, thank you for the book. I actually was finishing reading it just as I started my assignment here. I'm currently in the UAE, and actually was just finishing it as the Abraham Accords were announced while I was still in quarantine. So it was a very exciting time to be reading. But I was curious what you thought, and you actually alluded to it there right at the end. As we see it, it seems like not just Saudi, but the UAE and other partners also are are aiming more for a strategy of kind of the détente, the friends with multiple partners diplomacy with Turkey, and lifting the blockade with Qatar and those kind of steps. So as far as though my waspy nature gives me a hard time saying menage a trois with the US there, but as we start to remove that leg and either go to the right sizing or to the lessening of the US footprint here, do you see that as one of the things that will continue to push the Gulf partners and potentially the greater Arab world kind of on that path towards seeking greater détente with Iran and other adversaries? Or do you see it as more of an opportunity for other great powers or near peers, as the US sometimes like to call them, China and Russia, to sort of step in and fill that void?
So China is definitely looking to fill a void, and the Saudis are eagerly talking to the Chinese, as are the UAE, but keeping all their options open. I don't think that there is a real détente possible between Iran and Saudi Arabia today. I think that as long as the Houthis are lobbing rockets at Saudi Arabia, as long as Hezbollah has such a chokehold on Lebanon, it's going to be difficult to have a détente. And I don't see what Iran is going to get in return for pulling back, on Lebanon and Yemen. So I think that is kind of the facts that we're dealing with. I think that what the Saudis and the Emiratis might try to do is to almost you can't circumvent Iran, but to sort of contain it in ways that, by getting involved in Iraq with, multi-billion-dollar projects on energy and, tackling climate change, which is something they're talking to the Iraqis about, which is a smart way of undercutting Iran. Iran hasn't, I'm not sure what Iran is doing in Iraq other than siphoning off funds. I don't see a project that serves Iraqis. Neither do I see that in Lebanon. What is the project that Iran is offering that is positive for the people of Iraq and Lebanon? I don't see it. I have a friend who coined this great phrase. You can talk about axis of evil, you can talk about axis of destruction, and that's kind of what we're left with in Lebanon, which is a shell of the country that it used to be. And again, here, it's not all at the feet of Iran, and it's not all at the feet of Hezbollah. Our own leaders are corrupt for their own reasons, and they've been involved in all sorts of things, but it is part of the equation. And so I think that more than a détente, I expect, reading the tea leaves and looking, talking to some Saudi officials and Emirati officials, I expect that they want to try to expand the Abraham Accords, as imperfect as they are, as a way of bringing people into a coalition that is not just a military coalition, because that didn't work out with Pakistan and Yemen, with Pakistan and Egypt against Yemen. To have something that is actually, in their view, positive and forward-looking, that is about business deals and climate change and tech and space and whatever, and make that the attractive proposition to people, so that Iraqis will say, hey, this militia is giving me $100 a month to be part of the militia, but that's kind of it. I don't have water, I don't have power, I don't have a job, but I kind of like this new project for power generation that the Saudis are working on with the Iraqi authorities. And so you start changing the narrative. And if the Saudis can pull that off, that is something that people in the region can get behind. And I don't know whether that's what they're thinking. That's something that, one senior Saudi official told me a year and a half ago, and I'm starting to see the contours of that coming together. But I don't see, as long as we have this leadership in Iran and this leadership in Saudi Arabia, I don't see an actual détente.
Okay, we have 9 minutes and 4 hands raised, so I want to make sure to get to them. I can't resist though saying, given that you are Lebanese, it does seem unusual to me that you would foreground the Iranian-Saudi rivalry in the travails of your own country, given that the Lebanese civil war started in 75. I mean, probably well before you were born, but the fact of the matter is that, sectarianism existed, at least in your country, without any help from the Iranians. So I'll just, sorry, go ahead.
But it didn't exist. So first of all, there was sectarianism, and it was a war in which Muslims killed Muslims and Christians killed Muslims and Christians killed Christians, and everybody killed everyone. But Lebanon plays an interesting role in this whole saga, because it is where Iranian revolutionaries trained to then go bring down the Shah in the 70s, in a country that was very permissive, where there was not one dictator, but plenty of militias. The war in Lebanon was part of the changing dynamics of the Cold War. It moved from Vietnam to Lebanon, a Cold War that was very, warm and violent for people within the global South. And so Lebanon plays an important cameo at the beginning, as it provides a training ground for Iranian revolutionaries. And then it is the birthplace of Hezbollah. And it is the actual making of, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who come to Lebanon and who build on their ties. Those people who become Revolutionary Guards, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, were in Lebanon. Some of them were in Lebanon. They have these ties from when they were training in Lebanon with the Palestinians. Again, it was the left, it was liberation movements, it was, anti-imperial against the Shah, but some of them were Islamists. And those come back to Lebanon, they find their old colleagues, and, they set up Hezbollah before 1982. So that's how Lebanon features in that. And then fast forward to 2005, and the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the former Lebanese prime minister, who was very much a product. And I'm just thinking about that now. He was a product almost of the Saudi-Iranian détente of the 90s. That's what made it possible for him to be prime minister in Lebanon. Because you had Hezbollah already present, and you had Saudi influence, and he was very much, the Saudi king's favorite son. He made his fortune in Saudi Arabia, and he comes back to Lebanon, and he exemplifies the modus vivendi that the Saudis and the Iranians find in the 90s as they are looking at Saddam Hussein, their new common enemy. And when he gets assassinated, when Rafiq Hariri gets assassinated in 2005, it's because the Iranians have decided to go all out and to try to claw back territory that they think is theirs or that they've lost, and they want to redo the score of the Iran-Iraq war. But again, you're absolutely right. We are also responsible for being, for pulling the trigger, for being willing participants, for being in this war, for fighting it, and for not. I don't want to say we're responsible for the leaders that we have, because I think that's too facile to tell people you get the leaders you deserve. Sometimes there are, larger factors that you just can't, you can't as a voter, undo. But, our leadership is very much a product of its own, corruption.
Yeah, no, well said. Okay, I'm going to, we have 3 questions. I think we're only going to be able to take 2. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take each question and then you can respond to them both? So the first comes to us from George Theodosiou, and let me ask him to unmute. You're muted, sir.
I'll make it very brief. Historically, Islam has been one of the most tolerant religions, especially when compared with Christianity or others. And also historically, the intervention of the Western powers beginning in World War I was what made intolerance, both religious and nationalism, was introduced into Middle East after the First World War. So in a utopian manner, what do you foresee the possibility of withdrawal of Western influence, or at this point, both Western and Eastern, i.e. China? You think that without that, would the outcome in the Middle East have been different?
Okay, excellent question. So this is one that says, let's not look at Saudi Arabia and Iran. The problem is much deeper, and it should be laid at the feet of the Western powers that have been meddling in the region. Okay, the next question will be from Dr. Ali Talib-Nijad, and let me ask him to unmute.
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate your fresh and deep views on a very complex issues. As you might know, when it comes to Iran and changes in Iran, there are direct and indirect references to Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, in the direction of, there shouldn't be any change there because it's going to be turmoil there. And then I'm going to come back to opposition groups inside and outside Iran. There are many of those. They don't have a united front, but all of those have agreed and very clearly that we are believing in freedom, we are believing in democracy, vote of people, and so on. But despite that, most of the Western news and also the US news are appeasing Iran based on that premise that if there is any change, it's going to be turmoil. So we should deal with them at this, whatever they are doing. I wanted to know your opinion in this direction. Thank you.
It's interesting. I mean, the two questions kind of rejoin. I mean, what is the role of the US in all this? And is it best for the US to just take its hands off the region? Is it better to have China, or should none of these powers be involved? I mean, unfortunately, again, just going back to my sort of realist pragmatism tinted with idealism, because I remain hopeful, I remain, confident that we can overcome a lot of these challenges. I think the reality is that there will always be meddling. I don't think that that's something we can, that we can wish away. And if it's not America, it's going to be Russia. And if it's not Russia, it's going to be China. And frankly, America's made a lot of mistakes in the region. And George was absolutely right that some of the Western policies during World War I and World War II are what introduced not just nationalism, but also sectarianism and Islamism in some of the region, and how it's used as a tool to rally people. And that's been very detrimental. It was done by the Nazis at the time as a way to rally people to their side. So I think that we cannot wish away any of these outside powers, but I think that people should be clear-eyed about what their options are, and they should be clear-eyed about whether they prefer Russian and Chinese influence or whether they prefer American influence, because that's what's on the menu. There is no, I wish for no outside influence on the menu. Unfortunately, these are the two choices. It's Russia and China or America. And some people will tell you, the Russians and the Chinese, they come and they, well, the Russians bombed Syria to smithereens, but the Chinese come with projects, with ports, with technology, with climate change solutions, with solar power. It comes with a lot of, authoritarianism as well. I mean, I think if you speak to people in Hong Kong today, they're not too happy about how their city is changing. And when it comes to Iran, I think that it's a tricky line to toe between talking to the Iranians and looking like you're appeasing them. I mean, no one in this region wants another war. And I haven't spoken to many, if any, people who wish to see forceful action by the West to change the regime in Iran. So unfortunately, this is also going to be a process which is going to be driven by internal dynamics and by Iranians themselves.
Okay, I think unfortunately we have to end it here, even as I am keenly feeling that we need another hour and a half to, probe your really deep thoughts on this issue. So first, I just want to thank—
Is that an invitation to come back?
Without question, and inshallah we'll do it in person. So first, I just want to thank Kim Ghattas for such an enlightening talk and discussion. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for having me, Tarek, and thank you for the great questions.
And I want to thank all of the members of our audience for joining us and for their great questions. And I'd like to thank our crack program coordinator, Mary Fulham, for producing this event. And Mary has instructed me to remind you all to join us again in 2 weeks on Friday, November 19th at 1 p.m. for a talk on Afghanistan and the latest developments there with former U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker. And you can register for that event on our website, www.hks.harvard.edu/Middle East, where you'll eventually be able to see the video of today's event with Kim Ghattas, and where you can sign up for our mailing list and have the wonderful opportunity to stay in touch with everything that the Middle East Initiative is doing. Again, Kim Ghattas, thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Tarek, and thank you to all who joined, and thank you for the great questions. Until the next time.
See you again soon.
Thank you. Good night from Beirut.
Bye-bye.